Between 1933 and 1945, more than 100 Nazi concentration camps were established throughout Europe. Brutality, inhuman conditions, forced labor, systematized death, torture, suffering, and scientific experiments were part of daily life in these blocks. All were characteristics of these places, which represented one of the darkest creations of the human being. But there were other, hidden aspects, such as sadism and entertainment, that satisfied the desires of those twisted human minds. This is the story of the dark and cruel methods of entertainment created by the Nazis in the concentration camps. Welcome to the Martial Memoirs. Hell for prisoners, pleasure for guards. The concentration camps were created with the aim of outlawing and eliminating anyone who was considered a threat to the regime, whether they were an internal or external threat. Political opponents, sexual and ethnic minorities, those considered social misfits by the Nazis, and anyone considered deviant because of their crimes, sexual or religious practices, all entered through these gates. The Nazis claimed that rehabilitation was the main function of the concentration camps, and for that reason it was justified that mistreatment was necessary to break the moral resistance of those considered wrong in their thoughts and practices by the Nazis. Men and women who were forcibly taken to these camps were stripped of all traces of identity and humanity. They became the object of systematic assaults on their basic needs, and many of them became guinea pigs for scientific experiments as well as mere playthings to entertain their captors. Not only adults, whether communists, Jews or gypsies, were victims of this kind of action. Also, children found themselves subject to endless sadistic scientific experiments or simply to satisfy the dark desires of these killing machines. Many SS soldiers gradually became less than human. They lost all sensitivity towards those they considered enemies. They did not discriminate in their treatment of old people or children. They even dared to mess with pregnant women and make what they wanted of them. Since they knew that their lives were in their hands, and they could almost do whatever they wanted with them and their belongings, the SS soldiers experimented on many people captured and detained in the concentration camps. People were objectified, and many SS soldiers used them for entertainment in various ways. Among the best-known methods of entertainment, we find that the Nazis organized boxing exhibitions with the weak prisoners, also soccer matches with some players who were on the verge of death due to starvation. They also used the talent of some to create music orchestras to cover the screams of horror in the camp blocks. But Himmler's men not only used Jews and political opponents as objects of sporting and artistic pleasure, they also fetishized them to the point of making them the object of their darkest sadistic and sexual pleasures. In this respect, the Nazis did not differentiate between men and women or children and adults. All became mere objects with which the soldiers could satisfy their appetite for human destruction. Thus, before or after torturing them, beating and starving them to death or leading them to the gas chamber, many SS soldiers in the concentration camps did whatever they wanted with these people, just for their own amusement. In this way, what represented a real hell for the lives of entire families who saw how their lives were slowly torn apart and how they were exploited in every aspect. For the guards, these concentration camps also became a place of pleasure for them. They not only fulfilled their duty to the Führer, they were allowed to enjoy themselves, to have time for recreation, and to use the prisoners as objects of enjoyment and pleasure. Boxing exhibitions in Nazi camps. For Heinrich Himmler, SS leader and one of the architects of the final solution, it was very important to keep the morale of his guards high, and for this, he believed that the Reich should invest in leisure, cultural and sporting activities. In this sense, boxing was perhaps one of the most important activities developed within these walls of hell. Young Perez was a French Jew who was born in Tunisia. He was the world middleweight champion of boxing in 1931. Only 12 years later, he was arrested by the Nazis in Drancy, France. He was imprisoned for not wearing the famous yellow star. From there, he was sent to a concentration camp, more precisely to Auschwitz-Monowitz. Soon his captors recognized him. His face looked familiar, and although his body was already battered, he showed signs of being a disciplined athlete. One day the guards asked Young to give them a private boxing demonstration. There he showed them his best tricks while the guards laughed and enjoyed a private show for which other citizens would have paid a fortune. Young Perez was allowed to train for a few days and was even allotted some extra rations in order to build up some of the muscle mass that had been so badly damaged by his time in the hell that was Auschwitz. Days later, the soldiers suggested he fight an SS guard, a rather stout soldier of about 165 pounds and 5.9 feet tall, almost 1.8 meters. It was a 3-round bout where Young emerged victorious. He was then assigned another opponent, whom he also defeated, an inmate named Paul Steinberg. The guards looked at him with admiration and enjoyment. They had in front of them a world champion doing a private boxing exhibition in the midst of the horror they were causing to humanity. But the case of young Perez was not the only one. Tadeusz Pietrzykowski was a Polish boxer who had been runner-up in the Polish bantamweight championship. He fought between 40 and 60 bouts between 1941 and 1943 in the main camp of Auschwitz. In that arena, he defeated several heavyweight German deportees and specifically also defeated his own capo, Walter Dunning. This made him the most famous boxing champion in Auschwitz, and he was applauded by the same Nazis who tortured him during the day. In the case of the Mauthausen camp, Segundo Espallargas was the boxing sensation in that place. Segundo was a Spanish Republican who was also known as Paulino, and fought every Sunday at the request of N4ZIS, commandant of the SS camp. Paulino, or Segundo, was known as the brave and undefeated boxer of Mauthausen. No one could defeat him, not even the powerful SS soldiers who dared to challenge him. For Paulino, fighting every Sunday was his only hope of staying alive. He believed that if he was sacrificed, the high command of the camp would lose its greatest attraction, which was watching him fight. However, that did not make him avoid some of the mistreatment and torture that all the prisoners suffered day after day. SS officers, no matter in which camp they worked, were boxing fanatics. To detect possible fighters, they consulted the files of the inmates, or even asked them during interrogation if they practiced boxing. Many prisoners lied and said they did, but were then defeated by those who really boxed. Boxing popularity was nothing new in Germany. When Hitler came to power, boxing became one of the big parts of the Nazi propaganda machine. Those were the times of the victories of Max Schmeling, Herbert Runge, and Willi Kaiser. The three of them had been victorious at the 1936 Berlin Olympics, and were exploited by Goebbels to reaffirm his theory of racial superiority. Boxing functioned not only as a method of propaganda, but also as a way to control and channel the violence of Nazi society in a controlled manner. The SS soldiers were then boxing fanatics, and the regime was going to give them their favorite entertainment in exchange for the supposed patriotic service they rendered to the Reich by capturing and torturing Jews in Auschwitz and the rest of the concentration camps. Melodies from Hell, the death orchestras in camps. Hitler loved music. His favorite composer was Richard Wagner, and he tried to transmit this taste for classical music to his subjects. In 1942, the director of Neuengamme concentration camp requested a piano for his camp. It was a Volker 86, a stylish and very expensive piano. Apart from that, this camp was known to have very little expenditure on luxuries. The camp inspectors were very fond of classical music, or perhaps they pretended to be in order to please their Führer. Despite the taste for Wagner and other classical composers, in reality the German soldiers in the concentration camps were content with much simpler instruments. The harmonica became the instrument of choice in the camps and was used by prisoners and guards alike. Another instrument that used to be seen a lot around the blocks was the accordion. This instrument accompanied the few moments of leisure that both prisoners and guards could have, but it was much more common to see it in some of the Polish inmates who kept some strength in their arms to play it amicably. The SS officers had a weakness for the latter instrument of German origin and would gather to listen to those who could play it. The German leaders found it difficult to find professional musicians to play for them in the camps, so they decided to improvise new orchestras with inmates who would play for free for them in exchange for a few more food rations. In Auschwitz, the first orchestra formed entirely of prisoners began playing in January 1941. From that moment until their liberation, concerts were held every Sunday in the esplanade behind the terrible Block 24. This block was nothing more and nothing less than a brothel, where the Nazi soldiers satiated their sexual appetite with prisoners forced to prostitute themselves. In this way, the moans of pain from the sexual assaults of those innocent Jewish women were covered by the beautiful melodies played by the musicians, forced to give a concert for those sadistic soldiers. The Auschwitz Orchestra had a varied program that included works by Beethoven, Schubert, Bach, and Wagner himself. Another concentration camp did not want to be left behind in the face of the novel initiative of the Auschwitz hierarchs. It was the authorities of the Birkenau camp who created the second prisoners' orchestra. There, the musicians received preferential treatment compared to the other prisoners, and above all, the female prisoners. They were given an extra ration of food and even rations of brandy in exchange for their musical services. The Birkenau musicians even experimented with South American melodies in addition to playing the classical repertoire requested by their executioners. Such was the success of the SS prisoner orchestras that the industrial camps of the Auschwitz complex began to have their own orchestras to cheer up the savage Nazi captors. Coco Schumann was a young German who was a pioneer of swing in that land. He was imprisoned in Theresienstadt and then deported to Auschwitz. Schumann probably found his way to survive hell on earth because he was very popular with the soldiers. The guards would ask his orchestra to play his classic The Dove to reassure the prisoners as they walked to the gas chamber, so this German swing hit became the pre-death melody heard by hundreds of Jews. Another famous orchestra was formed in the Birkenau women's camp under the direction of Chief Supervisor Maria Mandl. It was conducted by a Jewish prisoner named Alma Rose. She organized 2 concerts a week for the pleasure of her captors. The group began playing on instruments seized from murdered Jews. Alma Rose was so acclaimed by the Nazi audience at Birkenau that one day she shushed 2 guards who kept talking while the concert was going on. After a while, she realized that this gesture that came naturally to her could have ended her life. But Alma was too important for the leisure of those soldiers and guards, and for that reason they spared her life. Chess, cards, tarot, and more entertainment for the Nazis. The SS guards also liked to play a wide range of board games. Requests came from commandants and local directors for such games, which were all the rage in Nazi families. There were games of all its types: dice games, card games, strategy games. For example, Fang den Hut was a board game launched during the Weimar Republic that was still very popular during the war years. It was a game in which the pieces were hat-shaped and could be stacked. The board was round with a central cross and appealed to the logic of its participants, although it was a game that was also very popular with children because of its simplicity. Other games, a bit more adult-themed, were also normal to see on the desks of the directors, but also in the corridors between guards. Chess and checkers were really popular in the leisure time of the savage SS butchers. Many prisoners were sometimes invited by their executioners to measure their skills in chess and checkers, but especially the Ukrainians recruited by the Waffen-SS and destined to the camps were really skilled in both chess and checkers and used to defeat in the games the SS officers who looked at them with suspicion because they secretly believed them to be smarter than them. That is why also many prisoners let themselves be beaten, because the fact that a player of a supposedly inferior race beat them in games that tested intelligence went against the whole Nazi propaganda apparatus. Although sometimes it also used to be justified that the Jews beat the Nazis in games like chess because one of the most common Nazi accusations against the Jews was their supposed cunning in cheating the good German campman, both to get money out of him and to take advantage of him, his purity and innocence. It is possible then that many a chess game between a captor and a prisoner resulted in savage beatings because of the adverse outcome for the executioner. Cards used to be the most popular game among soldiers and captives. Dozens and dozens were delivered to the barracks, the most popular being Skatkarten. Skat was an old German game from Thuringia, and its great popularity was born among the soldiers during the First World War. Other soldiers were even encouraged to play tarot, a somewhat widespread occult practice among the Nazis. In this regard, it should be noted that, despite being on the surface fervently Catholic, the Nazis felt a particular attraction to all esoteric practices such as astrology, alchemy, Kabbalah, and theosophy. They had an enormous respect for all those disciplines that towards the end of the 19th century began to be reviled by the highest circles of society. The Nazis, on the other hand, both secretly and publicly affirmed their belief in the stars, and this was somehow related to the regenerative mission they had for humanity. Therefore, it is not surprising that the practice of the tarot began to become popular in the concentration camps. Perhaps many of these soldiers wanted to seek explanations in the stars and in the beyond about the tremendous mission they had been given and what awaited them for their future. Playing soccer in camps to survive. Many SS soldiers worked on their bodies to compensate for the long hours spent stationary in watchtowers or guard posts. Some engaged in weightlifting and others spent their time playing or watching soccer, a sport that was becoming popular in Germany. The Nazis believed in sport as a way of mobilizing men in a collective and competitive effort, and in this respect, soccer and handball were two favorite sports for Himmler's men. Throughout World War II, several soccer and handball teams were formed, and some of them participated inside the concentration camps. S teams participated in championships against teams from other nearby organizations such as the Luftwaffe or the Wehrmacht. Also, the soldiers of the camps of the Polish general government organized several championships among themselves, not only because of the Nazis' idea of sport, and particularly of competitive and collective sport, but also because from 1942 the Nazi war machine relied more and more on the slave labor available in the concentration camps. Himmler needed the workers in the camps to produce more and better, and for that reason he did not think it was a bad idea to give them a little rest on Sundays, which many prisoners took advantage of to go to soccer matches, and some of them even played them. Before Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933, there were clubs in Germany founded by Jewish communities that were later banned and closed. Two of the most popular were the Bar Kochba in Frankfurt or the Hakoah in Essen. Just as famous boxers were paraded in the concentration camps, there were also footballers who were imprisoned and sent to these places of death. Among some of the best known were Heinz Kurz, Bela Gutmann, Eddie Hamel, and Julius Hirsch. Saturnino Navazo was a Spanish soccer player of Republican militancy. He was arrested in France by the Germans and transferred to the Mauthausen camp. When the Nazis found out who he was, they decided that, instead of putting him to work in inhuman conditions, the best thing to do was to starve him a little, but give him a little extra ration for training them in soccer. Thanks to his talent, Navazo was transferred to the kitchen where he was able to live a little better, and was even able to save the life of a Jewish boy from Frankfurt named Siegfried Meyer, whom he adopted as his son towards the end of the war. Those famous stories of prisoners playing the match of their lives against guards are not entirely true. Many times the matches took place in very precarious conditions. The match was not always 11 against 11. Sometimes it was played with rag balls, and the prisoner teams were formed according to different criteria. The Nazis liked to form teams of prisoners according to their nationalities, according to their trade. That is to say, in some camps there were teams of carpenters, teams of cooks, teams of cleaning personnel, among others. What is certain is that the SS enjoyed playing soccer matches among themselves and forced the prisoners to attend and applaud. They also had fun watching how they played among starving prisoners with little physical preparation. Some even fainted in the middle of the match and were dragged out by their arms because the soccer show had to continue. Ilse Koch, the bitch of Buchenwald. It was not only by playing sports or watching prisoners on the verge of death that the Nazis entertained themselves. One of their greatest hidden obsessions was sex. The Nazis exalted beauty by building an almost Greek cult of the body. In their art, in their films, and in their daily life, nudity and sex were present. Sex obsessed many of the Nazi hierarchs and also the soldiers in concentration camps. In this respect, there is a story that deserves to be told because of its impact, that of Ilse Koch, better known as the Buchenwald Bitch, a fanatic Nazi soldier, nymphomaniac, sadist and murderer. Angelic-looking, with slightly curly red hair and a face that looked as if it had been carved by the Greek gods, Ilse Koch was a sensation among her SS comrades. She was a natural seductress and knew how to use her beauty to get what she wanted, not only on a political level, but also to satisfy her most basic impulses. Koch was a fervent fan of Nazi dogma. She admired the Führer with all her heart. Her political fanaticism, her power of oratory, her beauty and her capacity for seduction earned her the place of one of the most important concentration camp supervisors of the SS. Her real name was Margaret Ilse Köhler, and she came from an urban middle-class background. Her father had worked in a factory during the Weimar Republic, and that also led her down the same path. After a few years, she got a job in a bookstore, where she probably first came into contact with Nazi ideology. She joined the Nazi Party in 1932 and met Heinrich Himmler in person, who introduced her to her future husband Karl Koch, one of the SS chief's chief deputies. Her new husband was a colonel in the Sachsenhausen concentration camp. She married him in 1936, and in 1939 they both moved to Buchenwald, where her life changed forever. They had 3 children in Buchenwald, but one of them died while they were skiing on vacation. The nanny called to tell them the news, but they were undeterred and continued their vacation. Her husband began already in Sachsenhausen to be considered as one of the cruelest and most brutal colonels. The prisoners told that he liked to punish his prisoners with a whip that had razor blades. Karl Koch also enjoyed torturing by using hot iron or crushing the fingers of those he interrogated. It is said that his face of pleasure while this was happening was unmistakable. Ilse Koch learned from one of Nazi Germany's most famous torturers. They were united not so much by love as by pleasure in the pain of others. That is why Ilse asked her husband to build a huge estate a few meters away from the Buchenwald concentration camp in order to display all his dark and sadistic pleasures. Within those walls, Ilse and Karl organized collective orgies in rooms full of mirrors. Ilse Koch began to fill her closets with the most expensive clothes and perfumes in Europe. She was obsessed with her appearance. She liked to ride horses and was also seen in person riding through the countryside with a whip in hand. Another of her great pleasures was to throw hungry dogs on pregnant prisoners. Ilse laughed and squealed with pleasure at the sight of such a horrific spectacle. This he did during the day, but during the night Koch transformed himself into an even more depraved demon. In that room of mirrors, she organized lesbian orgies with up to 12 women at the same time, and her husband's subordinates also participated in these spectacles, who were taken almost by obligation by the fearsome woman. One of the most depraved practices of Ilse was to wait with naked breasts for the new prisoners who arrived at Buchenwald, trembling with fear. To them she began to make sexual comments and took their hands to their bodies, but when they dared to look at her, she hit them with her whip. Her degeneracy knew no bounds. Lamps with human skin and other Ilse Koch's hidden hobbies. While displaying her nymphomaniac pleasures on her huge estate, Ilse Koch, the bitch of Buchenwald, discovered a new hidden hobby, that of making furniture out of human skin. On April 11, 1945, a young American soldier named Abner Garnett came to some lockers in Buchenwald. When he entered that room, his face turned pale. He found delicately shaped lamps painted with beautiful butterflies and birds. Garnett approached the lamp and found that something was wrong. When he came in contact with them, he automatically began to vomit, as did his colleagues. They could not believe their eyes. The lamps were made of tightly stretched human skin. Suddenly, behind her back appeared a woman with an angelic face and colorful curls. It was Ilse Koch herself, who told her that the lamps were hers and asked her if she thought they were beautiful. She showed no shame or regret, but rather pride in her macabre handiwork. But not only lamps. Koch also had a huge, very flirtatious handbag made of the same material. The lamps were only the beginning of a spectacle worthy of the worst horror movie imaginable. Ilse Koch also liked to decorate her home with other objects. The Buchenwald bitch had a passion for collecting human heads of the murdered concentration camp prisoners. She had more than 12 of them on display in her living room. Their size was particular, since she had them chemically shrunk to make them smaller than the normal size. Koch had an obsession with human skin in all its forms. She also liked tattoos. In her house, the American soldiers found photo albums of prisoners' tattoos, and it was believed that Ilse had a great interest in this type of skin work. This photo album had been put together by one of her many lovers, SS Dr. Erich Wagner. It is said that Ilse had become so obsessed with his work that she had asked her husband to kill all the prisoners that Wagner had photographed in order to have their skin work exhibited in her home and to be able to make various decorative objects or clothes out of their skins. Ilse Koch would have put to work for her in the dissection of corpses for this type of entertainment, the same prisoners who had been up to that moment barrack mates of those unfortunate men killed for their tattoos. One prisoner even went so far as to claim that Ilse would have made panties out of tattooed human skin. He was one of those prisoners that Ilse Koch went to look for at the gate of the concentration camp to seduce him by showing him part of her body. And when he succumbed to the charms of the bitch of Buchenwald, he could see her panties, but his fate was already written, and minutes later he would be brutally beaten with the whips, for more pleasure of the insensitive Nazi lady. Her taste for dissection and decoration with human skin soon transcended the borders of Buchenwald and became the taste of other wives of concentration camp commandants. Jewish kids that became Nazi toys. The Nazi concentration camp guards not only enjoyed punishing and hardshipping adult men and women, some enjoyed something even more macabre, which was to turn concentration camp children into their objects of pleasure. Some SS guards enjoyed beating Jewish children against the walls until they vanished to the despair of their mothers who were captured and could not help themselves. Other children in Auschwitz and Buchenwald were desperately hungry, and this led them to search for food wherever they could. The braver children and adolescents dared the forbidden to steal food from the camp officials themselves. Many of these children ended up in the worst way, not only murdered but brutally beaten to death. Children in concentration camps found themselves subject to subhuman conditions. Some were sent to forced labor, others had to live with hunger as their daily sensation. Some others saw their younger siblings die in their own arms before the indifferent and sometimes pleasurable gaze of the SS soldiers. But the most macabre of all is the story of Eva and Miriam, twin sisters who became the favorite plaything of the terrible Josef Mengele, known as the Angel of Death. Eva and Miriam Moses Kor were sent to Auschwitz with their family in 1944. Josef Mengele, in those years already known as the Angel of Death, performed all kinds of experiments on human beings there in Auschwitz. One of the greatest obsessions of one of the greatest criminals in the history of mankind was to discover the secret behind the birth of twins, because one of the Führer's greatest objectives was to make the Germans reproduce quickly and populate all of Eastern Europe. To achieve this goal, Mengele believed that discovering the secret behind the reproduction of twins could help this objective so that more and more Germans would be able to have 2 or 3 children. Eva and Miriam were only 14 years old when they fell into the terrible hands of Josef Mengele. This doctor from hell used to walk around the Auschwitz barracks in a pristine white suit and entice children with chocolates to greet him. Mengele treated them well initially, but from then on he scanned their bodies to find out if they were really suitable for his experiments. So he met Eva and Miriam, who became his favorite toys for scientific experimentation. Mengele enjoyed tying the twins by the arms to restrict their blood circulation until they passed out. At that time, Mengele would inject chemicals into their eyes and give them more than 5 injections in other parts of their bodies. Prisoners at Auschwitz told how the children always eagerly approached Mengele, who appeared to be harmless, and every time they left his experiment barracks, they came out crying and screaming. The Angel of Death, on the other hand, came out with a smile from ear to ear and whistling some classical melody. Not only had he fulfilled his scientific duty, the sadistic doctor took pleasure in carrying out this kind of martyrdom on Jewish and Gypsy children. The Mauthausen brothel. Although the Nazis were really conservative in sexual practices, this seemed more a matter of discourse than reality. The Nazis believed that sexual activity was necessary to maintain the Aryan race and to populate Europe with supposedly superior Germans, so they encouraged both premarital sex and teenage sex. But they maintained that the main objective was not personal pleasure, but to have sex in order to reproduce in honor of the Führer. In this respect, a big problem for Hitler seemed to be homosexuality. If there were men and women with this type of sexual decisions, the possibility to reproduce was shortened. That is why Himmler thought it would be a good idea to install a network of brothels in the different concentration camps. While in meters the death took place in series, the SS soldiers in charge of making this gloomy system work could have promiscuous sexual relations in order not to forget their masculinity and not be tempted to have relations with other soldiers, or even worse, to mix with Jewish women and be tempted to sexually attack their female prisoners. One of these famous brothels was the one set up in Mauthausen, which was nothing less than the first one set up for the amusement of these insatiable guards. In this camp, the brothel was set up in Barracks 1 and in a building in the Gusen subcamp. There passed nothing more and nothing less than 35 German women of humble origins who were recruited with the objective that soon they would be liberated. However, this did not happen, and the brothel in Mauthausen became a hell for them while it satiated the sexual appetite of the SS murderers. But this brothel was not only accessed by soldiers, but also by some prisoners. The Jews and Soviets were left out of this little pleasure that some Austrians, German political prisoners, and some Frenchmen indulged in. Many of these lucky prisoners were looking more for an affectionate moment of sharing and listening than for a sexual relationship. There is another side to this story, and that is the lucky prisoners who were selected to indulge in this type of pleasure. None of them were Jewish, and to earn such a prize they had to be obedient workers in the service of any kind of SS wishes. Most of them were the most prominent building repair workers, plumbers, electricians, cooks, or even musicians and soccer players. It is noteworthy that those selected by the Nazis to spend a night with one of these women and who were of communist affiliation were the most likely to refuse such an invitation. In fact, they invited the rest of their comrades to resist the temptation and not to abuse the situation of sexual slavery in which these poor German women found themselves. Those who sought only to entertain themselves and treat these poor women as objects were the SS soldiers who made some women have to be with more than 5 Germans in a single day. Sexual pleasure for these despicable murderers was assured while these women were counting the hours for the Allies to liberate them. Adolf Hitler believed that his mission was to change the world, and it was necessary to create a new humanity, where the Aryans would dominate the rest of the people. This mission required the involvement of the German people as a whole, and also and above all of the soldiers who accompanied him in this madness. The Nazis created the concentration camps as places where they removed their greatest ethnic and political enemies from society, and used them as slave labor to contribute to their war economy. But they soon realized that the prisoners could also serve as objects of their darkest pleasures and amusements. The SS guards needed leisure, and what better way to satisfy that need than to use these already dehumanized people? With this objective in mind, the Nazis entertained themselves by organizing boxing exhibitions, soccer games, card games, musical orchestras, brothels, and even used them as raw material for the gloomy decoration of the houses of their most macabre exponents, such as the Koch family. The Nazis in the concentration camps demonstrated that the deepest horror inflicted on a human being can be complemented by the pleasure, enjoyment, and leisure of those who carry it out. These episodes lead us to reflect in a very profound way how dark a human being can be.